Celeste Vaughn has earned her wings, but winning trust is another battle. A skeptical captain, a suspicious passenger, and a crisis that threatens hundreds of lives. Celeste must prove that skill and courage matter more than prejudice. Can she rise above it all and become the hero this flight desperately needs? Celeste Vaughn stood before the towering glass windows of the crew lounge, her gaze fixed on the Boeing 777 resting on the tarmac. The early morning sunlight gleamed off its sleek metal frame, but in her mind, the path ahead was far rougher than any runway she had ever landed on. Today was not just another day. This was her first flight as a first officer, a milestone not only in her career, but in the battle to break the invisible barriers that had long caged women of color in the aviation industry. Celeste was no stranger to doubt. From the moment she had set foot in flight school, she had known she would have to work twice. No, 3 times as hard to prove herself. She had aced every test, outperformed expectations, and become one of Aurora Airlines' most promising young pilots. And yet, despite everything, she could not change the way men like Gideon Wright looked at her. Stepping into the briefing room, Celeste immediately spotted Captain Gideon Wright, the man who would share the cockpit with her today. Nearly 3 decades of flight experience made him one of the airline's most seasoned captains. His silver-streaked hair was neatly combed, his piercing blue eyes unreadable, and his posture carried the weight of thousands of hours spent commanding the skies. Gideon Wright did not need words to establish who he was. A traditionalist to the core, he believed piloting was an art honed through relentless, real-world experience, not textbooks or modern training programs. And above all, he did not believe in so-called equal opportunities in this field, especially for someone like Celeste. As she entered, his eyes flickered toward her, then back to the stack of flight plans before him, as though she were little more than a shadow in the room. His silence was not a welcome, it was a message. She did not belong here. Beside Celeste, Raven Cole, the lead flight attendant, watched the scene unfold with her usual quiet composure. In her early 40s, tall and poised, with dark curls tied neatly at the nape of her neck, Raven exuded an air of professionalism that left little room for interpretation. Having spent years navigating the unspoken hierarchies of the aviation world, Raven had seen many like Celeste, young, talented, and forced to fight for every ounce of recognition. She did not dismiss Celeste, but she was not in a hurry to stand in her corner either. From Raven's perspective, Celeste might be a good pilot, but was she resilient enough to survive a cockpit under Gideon Wright? She would wait and see before making her judgment. The crew briefing began. This was no ordinary commercial flight. It was a humanitarian mission, carrying emergency supplies, food, medicine, and essentials, along with a team of volunteer doctors to a disaster-stricken region. Their task was to navigate treacherous skies, with a tropical storm forming along their route. This was more than a test of skill, it was a test of nerve. One misstep, and the mission could unravel. Celeste knew she had to be flawless from the start. There was no room for error. She had to prove that she not only deserved her place in the cockpit, but that she could earn the trust of this crew. Yet as the meeting continued, she could feel Gideon's gaze on her, sharp, assessing, as though he was merely waiting for the moment she would fail. The door to opportunity had cracked open, but the road ahead was still fraught with turbulence. The crew meeting commenced in a solemn atmosphere. Everyone's attention was fixed on the large control screen in the briefing room, displaying the planned route for Flight AA-721, a humanitarian relief mission from New York to a disaster-stricken region in Central America. Celeste sat upright, fingers intertwined on the table. No one said it out loud, but she knew they were all watching her. The feeling wasn't unfamiliar. She had faced it since the day she stepped into aviation. But today it was heavier, more palpable than ever. Captain Gideon Wright flipped a page of the briefing documents before him, then glanced at Celeste with a slight furrow of his brow. His voice was deep and measured. "First Officer Vaughn, this is your first flight with Aurora Airlines in this role, correct?" Celeste nodded. "Have you flown a similar route before? Or handled a Boeing 777 in complex weather conditions?" The question was more than a simple inquiry about her qualifications. It was a test, a reminder that, in his eyes, she was still an outsider. Celeste remained composed. I've flown the 777 during training and have experience handling emergency scenarios in the cockpit. Additionally, I've served as first officer on multiple long-haul flights aboard the Boeing 737 and Airbus A320. Gideon let out a dry, humorless chuckle. Theory and reality are two very different things, Vaughn. In extreme conditions, experience is what makes the difference. His words weren't overtly harsh, but the weight behind them was enough for everyone in the room to feel it. Celeste inhaled slowly. She had heard this before, and she knew she would hear it again. I understand that, Captain, but I believe we are here to work as a team. Gideon didn't respond right away. He simply leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, and gave a slight nod. We'll find out soon enough. The tension in the room thickened after their brief exchange. Across the table, some of the crew exchanged glances. No words were spoken, but their expressions were telling. Michael Carter, the lead engineer, raised an eyebrow, skepticism evident in his eyes. He was a firm believer in real-world experience over credentials. Samantha Lewis, a seasoned flight attendant, pressed her lips together, neither voicing support nor outright doubt. Raven Cole, the chief purser, remained composed, but Celeste could tell she was watching closely. As the meeting adjourned, people began gathering their documents. Just as Celeste stood to leave, Raven stepped beside her unexpectedly. I've worked with many captains like Gideon, Raven murmured, her voice low yet warm. He's not one to embrace change easily. Celeste turned to her. So, what do you suggest I do? Raven gave a slight shrug. Prove you deserve to be here. But don't just use words. Her tone wasn't exactly encouraging, nor was it dismissive. It was simply a reminder, a truth that Celeste already knew too well. Recognition in this world wasn't granted, it was earned. Celeste nodded, determination flickering in her eyes. I'm always ready. The cockpit door and the beginning of a greater challenge. 2 hours later, Celeste stepped into the cockpit. It was her first time taking the first officer's seat on an official Aurora Airlines flight. The control panel before her glowed, numbers, indicators, and signals flashing in precise, calculated patterns. Unlike people, they bore no bias, no doubt. Gideon was already seated in the captain's chair, performing system checks. He didn't look at her, merely gave a curt nod. We're preparing for engine startup. Monitor the systems and report back. His tone was neutral, not mocking but not welcoming either. Celeste placed her hands on the control panel, her voice steady. Understood, Captain. She knew this flight wouldn't be easy, but that was exactly why she was here. She would prove herself, no matter who doubted her. Aurora 721, runway 4R, cleared for takeoff. The air traffic controller's voice crackled in Celeste's headset. She took a deep breath, feeling the faint vibration of the aircraft's body as the jet engines roared to life. Ahead of her, the runway stretched under the sunlight, a defining moment in her career. Final pre-takeoff check, Gideon commanded, his voice firm. Celeste swiftly scanned the control panel, verifying each system. White heavy checkmark navigation system, normal. White heavy checkmark cabin pressure, stable. White heavy checkmark fuel levels, sufficient. White heavy checkmark flight control system, ready. All systems are good, Captain. Gideon gave a curt nod and pushed the throttle forward. Commencing takeoff, a powerful force pressed against Celeste's back as the aircraft surged down the runway. Speed climbed steadily. 80 knots, 120 knots, 150 knots. V1, Celeste's voice rang out, signaling the point of no return. Rotate. Gideon's response came just as steady. Celeste eased back on the control column, and in an instant, the Boeing 777 lifted off the ground, ascending into the boundless blue sky. At cruising altitude, she switched to autopilot and stole a glance to her side. Gideon was watching her. He said nothing, but the way he observed her every move made it feel like she was still sitting in an evaluation simulator, being tested. She stayed composed, double-checking the instruments before announcing over the radio. Aurora 721, cruising at assigned altitude. proceeding as planned. No mistakes, no errors. Yet, even when she did everything right, she could still feel the doubt lingering in the air. Tension in the cockpit. An hour into the flight, Gideon suddenly spoke. "Have you ever flown through severe turbulence, Vaughn?" Celeste recognized the underlying challenge in his question. She met his gaze and answered confidently. "I've flown through moderate turbulence and completed high-level turbulence simulations." Gideon let out a quiet, unimpressed scoff before turning his attention forward. "Simulations aren't real life." Celeste clenched her fists but kept her frustration in check. "I understand, Captain, but I believe what I've learned will serve me well when the moment comes." Gideon didn't respond, but the look on his face made one thing clear. He still wasn't convinced. The weight of perception. Celeste decided to step out of the cockpit for a moment to check on the cabin. As soon as she entered the main aisle, she felt it. The weight of their stairs. Michael Carter, the lead engineer, held her gaze briefly before looking away. Samantha Lewis, the senior flight attendant, gave her a small nod, neutral but guarded. Only Raven Cole remained unchanged, maintaining her usual calm demeanor as she reviewed the passenger manifest. When she saw Celeste approaching, she looked up and asked, "Everything okay?" "Yes." Celeste offered a small smile. Raven nodded, but instead of leaving, she added, "Gideon doesn't change easily. He's been doing things his way for decades." Celeste studied her, sensing the unspoken message. Proving herself wouldn't be easy. "I don't expect him to change his mind overnight, but I'm not backing down." For the first time, Raven truly looked at her. A moment of silence stretched between them before the faintest smile touched Raven's lips. "Good. Don't let him walk over you." It wasn't an open endorsement, but to Celeste, it felt like the first sign that Raven was starting to take notice. The first true test. Back in the cockpit, Celeste settled into her seat and rechecked the systems. But just then, a warning blip appeared on the radar. She frowned and examined the screen. A pocket of severe turbulence was forming ahead, stronger than originally predicted. Without hesitation, she spoke up. "Captain, we've got significant turbulence ahead. I recommend adjusting altitude to avoid it." Gideon glanced at the display, but instead of agreeing, his response was immediate. "We can fly through it. No need to change course." Celeste's frown deepened. The data was clear. Staying at this altitude meant risking much stronger turbulence than anticipated. "But based on the radar, I've flown this route countless times, Vaughn." Gideon cut her off, his tone final. "We'll be fine." Celeste pressed her lips together. This was it, a moment where she had to choose, fall in line with the captain's decision or stand her ground. The real challenge had begun. Outside the cockpit window, the once clear sky had turned a deep, ominous gray. Thick clouds churned ahead, warning of severe turbulence on their path. Celeste tightened her grip on the control column, her eyes locked on the radar. The data was undeniable. A strong air vortex was forming directly in their flight path. If they didn't adjust altitude soon, they would be flying straight into a dangerous turbulence zone. "Captain, I recommend we climb to FL 390 to avoid the unstable air ahead." Gideon remained calm, his gaze fixed forward. "I already told you, Vaughn. We can push through it, but the radar doesn't replace experience, First Officer." His voice was steady but firm, cutting off any further protest. Celeste pressed her lips together, forcing down her frustration. This wasn't just a matter of procedure. It was a battle for trust. Gideon wasn't dismissing her because of the data. He was dismissing her because she was new. But Celeste wasn't someone who backed down easily. "I don't doubt your experience, Captain, but numbers don't lie. If we maintain this altitude, we could encounter stronger turbulence than expected." Gideon stared at her for a long moment before exhaling sharply. "You worry too much, Vaughn. But fine, you handle the altitude request." Celeste didn't waste the opportunity. She immediately activated the radio, her voice steady. "Control, this is Aurora 721. Requesting climb to FL 390 to avoid turbulence ahead." A brief pause. Then the air traffic controller's voice crackled through her headset. "Aurora 721, request approved. Report when level." Celeste kept her expression neutral. suppressing the small surge of satisfaction inside her. Without hesitation, she adjusted the autopilot, guiding the aircraft into a steady climb. From the corner of her eye, she saw Gideon's grip on the throttle tighten, a small but telling sign of his displeasure. At FL 390, the flight stabilized. The turbulence they had anticipated never came. Celeste allowed herself a silent breath of relief. She had made the right call, but no one said it. Silence filled the cockpit. Gideon didn't reprimand her, but he didn't acknowledge her either. "Continue monitoring the flight parameters," he said, his tone flat. Celeste nodded, but she knew. The fact that she had overruled him was something he wouldn't forget easily. A quiet acknowledgement. Half an hour later, Celeste stepped out of the cockpit to check on the cabin. As she made her way through the aisle, Raven Cole intercepted her. "You did the right thing?" Celeste blinked, slightly caught off guard. "What do you mean?" Raven crossed her arms, her voice low but resolute. "If you hadn't insisted, we might have flown straight into a turbulence zone. Passengers could have panicked. Or worse, the aircraft could have suffered damage." Celeste held her gaze for a moment before nodding. "Thank you." It wasn't much, but to Celeste it meant everything. For the first time on this flight, she felt like someone was finally on her side. A shift in the air. When Celeste returned to the cockpit, Gideon was already seated, staring out at the sky. He said nothing as she took her seat. But then, as she was checking the control panel, his voice broke the silence. "You flew well, Vaughn." Celeste froze, glancing at him. Gideon didn't look at her. His tone was unreadable, but it was the first time he had acknowledged her competence. "Thank you, Captain." He didn't respond. But to Celeste, that single sentence was a sign, a crack in the wall of doubt that had surrounded her since the moment she stepped onto this flight. The journey was far from over. The challenges had only begun, but at least for the first time, she had taken a step forward. The night sky was pitch black, thick storm clouds churning outside the cockpit window. Lightning flashed in the distant horizon, its brief illumination reflecting off the instrument panel in front of Celeste. She kept her eyes locked on the radar screen, monitoring their course as the aircraft pushed deeper into the heart of the tropical storm. Everything remained stable, until the sudden blare of an alert shattered the silence. "Red circle system warning. GPS signal lost red circle." Celeste's hands moved instinctively, checking the instrument panel. The satellite navigation system had completely shut down. She pressed a few buttons to reboot it, but the screen only displayed a single, ominous message. "Warning, unable to connect to GPS, searching for signal." A cold knot of tension coiled in her chest. This wasn't a minor glitch. Losing GPS meant they had no precise positioning or heading. She turned sharply to Gideon. "Captain, we've lost GPS. I'm running diagnostics now." Gideon barely glanced at the screen before responding, his voice calm, almost dismissive. "It's nothing, Vaughn. We've entered the storm's range. Electrical interference from the cumulonimbus clouds is likely disrupting the satellite signal. I understand, but we need a backup solution. If the radar goes down too, we'll be completely blind." Gideon remained unfazed, his confidence unwavering, perhaps too unwavering. "I've flown through worse, Vaughn. Don't worry. The system will reconnect in a few minutes." Celeste wasn't so sure. Outside, the turbulence intensified. Powerful wind currents slammed into the aircraft, making it shudder. From the cabin intercom, Raven's composed voice rang out, steady and professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are passing through mild turbulence. Please remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened." Celeste glanced at the radar. Its display flickered with interference, signals disrupted by the storm. A troubling thought crossed her mind. If the systems continued to malfunction, they could drift off course without even realizing it. She turned back to Gideon, her voice firmer this time. "Captain, radar readings are inconsistent. We need to decide. Do we proceed as planned, or do we adjust our course?" Gideon frowned slightly, but still, he didn't seem convinced. "The radar is still functioning. We just need to give it time to stabilize. And if it doesn't?" Celeste's gaze was unyielding. This time, Gideon didn't answer immediately. Then, a violent jolt rocked the aircraft. Metal groaned under the strain, and muffled gasps echoed from the cabin. At that moment, the cockpit door swung open. Michael Carter, the lead engineer, appeared, his expression tight with concern. "Something's off. This turbulence, it's stronger than it should be." Celeste turned to Gideon, waiting for his response. But for the first time on this flight, the captain didn't look so sure. He stared at the radar, its erratic readings flickering across the screen. His jaw clenched slightly. For the first time, Celeste saw hesitation in Gideon Wright's eyes. And she knew this was the moment she had to step up. "If the system doesn't come back online immediately, we can't afford to wait." Her voice was steady, unwavering. "I propose we switch to traditional navigation, ground-based radio beacons, and manual calculations." Gideon's head snapped toward her, his eyes sharp. "Are you questioning my judgment, Vaughn?" Celeste didn't flinch. "No, Captain. I'm doing what a first officer is supposed to do, offering solutions when we're facing a crisis." A heavy silence settled over the cockpit. At the door, Raven stood quietly, observing. She didn't interfere, but there was something new in her gaze, a subtle curiosity, as if waiting to see if Celeste would hold her ground. The air inside the cockpit was thick with tension, stretched taut like a wire about to snap. Outside, lightning crackled, illuminating the storm clouds that engulfed them. Celeste knew this was it. Either they took control now, or they would be at the mercy of the storm. She took a deep breath, bracing herself, because this time, she wouldn't let Gideon ignore her. Outside, the storm raged on. Winds howled against the fuselage, violent air currents hammering the wings, making the Boeing 777 lurch with each impact. In the cabin, gasps of alarm rippled through the passengers as the plane dipped slightly before stabilizing again. Inside the cockpit, the tension was suffocating. The radar screen flickered with interference, its readings unreliable. The GPS remained completely offline, leaving them flying blind with no dependable navigation system. Celeste stared at the failing data, knowing time was slipping away. She took a deep breath, then spoke. "Captain, we can't keep flying like this without a backup plan. I propose we switch to traditional navigation, using ground-based radio beacons and manual calculations." Gideon's head snapped up, his sharp blue eyes locking onto hers as if she had just suggested something absurd. "Radio beacons? Vaughn, what century do you think we're in? That method is decades old." Celeste didn't flinch, and yet it still works. "We can't keep relying on an automated system that's failing us." Gideon leaned back in his seat, arms crossed, his tone edged with challenge. "You really believe an outdated technique is the answer here?" Celeste clenched her hands into fists, but her voice remained steady. "I believe it's our safest option right now. If we can pick up signals from ground stations, we can determine our approximate position and adjust our heading manually. Pilots used to do this before GPS." Gideon scoffed, then gestured toward himself. "Vaughn, I've been flying for over 30 years. I've handled worse than this, and I respect that, Captain," Celeste replied evenly. "But experience doesn't replace data. When systems fail, we use whatever tools we have left." Gideon's eyes narrowed, irritation flickering across his face at being challenged by a younger first officer. "You want to navigate manually?" His voice was laced with skepticism. "Fine, prove it." Celeste didn't hesitate. She swiftly adjusted the radio communication system, scanning frequencies for the nearest operational beacon. Within seconds, a signal came through one of the air traffic control stations from Mexico City, roughly 200 nautical miles southeast of their position. "I've locked onto a ground station signal," she announced. "Cross-referencing it with our flight charts, we can pinpoint our approximate location and correct our heading." Gideon watched her work, saying nothing. From the doorway, Raven observed with quiet intensity, her expression unreadable, yet carrying a flicker of acknowledgement. Then, a bolt of lightning tore through the sky, illuminating the cockpit in a flash of white. A turbulence alert flared on the instrument panel. The plane shook harder than before, forcing both Celeste and Gideon to grip their seats. For the first time, Gideon clenched his jaw, not in confidence, but in doubt. Celeste seized the moment. "Captain, we can't wait for the GPS to come back. We need to act now." Gideon held her gaze, his internal conflict starkly visible. He didn't want to admit that he might have been wrong, but as the radar continued to fail him, he had no choice. "Fine, Vaughn," he said at last, exhaling sharply. "Lead the way." Without wasting a second, Celeste entered the beacon data into the system, recalculating their course. The plane shifted slightly, beginning to move out of the storm's most dangerous air currents. At the cockpit door, Raven gave a slow nod, an unspoken recognition, as if she had finally received an answer to a question she'd been holding since the start of the flight. Stepping closer, her voice was lower, softer than before. "You really do know what you're doing, don't you?" Celeste didn't look up from the controls, but the corner of her mouth lifted slightly. "That's why I'm sitting in this seat." The storm wasn't over yet, and neither was the battle for respect. As the aircraft steadied, Gideon exhaled but remained silent. Celeste knew he still wasn't ready to fully accept her. But at least now he was listening. She stared ahead, knowing this was just the beginning, and she was ready for the fight. Outside, the storm showed no signs of relenting. Fierce air currents battered the plane's wings, shaking the Boeing 777 with relentless force. In the cabin, frightened cries rang out as a violent jolt sent tray, table items crashing to the floor. Inside the cockpit, Celeste remained laser-focused, her eyes locked onto the instrument panel. "Captain, we're on the right course, but we haven't completely cleared the storm's reach. I recommend maintaining our heading and adjusting the angle of attack to minimize turbulence." Gideon studied the readings on the screen, then, for the first time, nodded without hesitation. "Do it, Vaughn." Without wasting a second, Celeste adjusted the aircraft's pitch, stabilizing their altitude to avoid the worst of the turbulent air pockets. Instantly, the violent shaking eased. A brief silence settled over the cockpit. Gideon cast a glance at Celeste, this time without skepticism in his eyes. At the doorway, Raven remained motionless, watching Celeste's every move. Then, after a long pause, she tilted her head slightly and murmured, "I have to admit, you really do know what you're doing?" Celeste didn't look away from the controls, but the faintest smile ghosted her lips. "That's why I'm sitting here." Raven gave a slow nod, as if she had finally found the answer to her unspoken doubts. Just as it seemed like they were regaining control, a new alert suddenly flashed red across the screen. Red circle warning. Fuel depletion rate exceeding expectations. Red circle. Celeste's brow furrowed as she scanned the fuel data. According to their initial flight plan, they should have had ample reserves to reach their destination safely. But now, the readings showed their fuel consumption rate was increasing by at least 20% more than projected. Her pulse quickened. She turned immediately to Gideon. "Captain, we have a fuel issue. I need time to determine the cause." Gideon's expression hardened, clearly unprepared for yet another complication, just as they had escaped the worst of the storm. "Check it, Vaughn." Celeste didn't reply. She was already analyzing the numbers. Something wasn't right. There were no signs of a fuel leak, yet their reserves were disappearing too fast. Beside her, even Gideon was beginning to feel a rare flicker of unease. The plane had escaped the most dangerous winds, but this flight was far from safe. Celeste's focus was razor-sharp as she combed through the fuel system data. Everything on the panel appeared normal. No leak indicators, no engine warnings. Yet their fuel was depleting at an alarming rate. Why? She quickly checked wind speeds. The storm had weakened, but they were still flying against an unexpectedly strong headwind. That could be forcing the engines to work harder, burning fuel faster than expected. "Captain, we're facing stronger than anticipated headwinds. That could be why our fuel consumption is higher." Gideon nodded slowly. This time he didn't dismiss her assessment. "Do we have enough to make it?" Celeste recalculated. At the current burn rate, they could reach their destination, but their reserve fuel would be dangerously low. If anything else went wrong, they would have almost no margin for error. She took a measured breath before answering. "We'll make it, but with critically low reserves. If we run into any more issues, we won't have many options." Gideon was silent for a few beats before he asked, "What do you suggest, Vaughn?" Celeste blinked. For the first time during this flight, Gideon was asking for her input rather than rejecting it outright. She scanned the flight map, then said firmly, "I recommend maintaining our current altitude to reduce drag and closely monitoring fuel consumption. If things worsen, we should consider diverting to an alternate airport." Gideon nodded, no argument this time. "Do it." Celeste swiftly adjusted the aircraft settings, then sent a request to air traffic control to keep a close watch on their fuel situation. Just then, Michael Carter, the lead engineer, stepped into the cockpit. His expression was tense. "Everything okay?" "I heard the fuel warning." Gideon answered first, his tone steady. "We have it under control." Celeste glanced at Michael, immediately sensing something off. He looked like he had more to say, but was holding back. She narrowed her eyes. "Did you find anything unusual?" Michael hesitated, glancing at Gideon before shaking his head. "No, nothing major. I'll keep monitoring." Celeste's unease deepened. Michael wasn't the type to get rattled easily, and right now he was definitely rattled. 15 minutes later, Celeste felt it again, that nagging feeling that something was wrong. She checked the fuel system one more time. The burn rate had stabilized somewhat, but there was still something off, a number that didn't quite add up. Comparing the current data to previous flights, she suddenly felt her pulse spike. "No way." She turned sharply to Michael, her voice tight. "Are you absolutely sure there's no fuel leak?" Michael flinched slightly, avoiding her gaze. A chill ran down Celeste's spine. "Michael, you need to tell me the truth. Something isn't right, is it?" Michael exhaled, his shoulders tensing. "There's one thing." His voice was low. "I noticed slight discrepancies in the fuel data, but I thought it was just a software glitch. Everything else checks out." Celeste's stomach twisted. Fuel data didn't just shift randomly. If it wasn't a glitch, it meant someone had tampered with the system. A cold realization settled over her. Someone on board had altered their fuel readings. Her mind raced. Who had access to Aurora Airlines systems? Who would even know how to manipulate them? Then, one name surfaced. Elias Cross. A passenger sitting in business class. The man who had been watching the cabin's control panel. The man who had carried a small tool case aboard. The man who was once a software engineer for Aurora Airlines, before he was fired for suspected sabotage. Celeste's breath caught. Could it be? She turned to Raven, her voice low but sharp. "I need you to check on a passenger." Immediately, Raven's eyes flickered with surprise, but she didn't question it. She simply nodded. "I'll handle it." As Raven left, Celeste turned back to the cockpit, staring at the flickering fuel data. She had no hard proof yet, but every instinct told her this was no ordinary malfunction. And if she was right, they were facing something far more dangerous than the storm they had just survived. Celeste felt a chill creep down her spine as she stared at the control panel. The fuel levels were still dropping faster than they should, even after she had factored in every possible cause. Headwinds? Maybe. Residual effects from the storm? Also possible. But the thing that unsettled her the most was the gut-wrenching certainty that this wasn't just a technical malfunction. Something had been tampered with. Michael Carter's hesitation in the cockpit, his avoidance of eye contact, the way he downplayed the anomalies, only deepened her suspicion. Something had been altered in the system, and if it wasn't a software glitch, that left only one explanation. Someone had done it intentionally. Her fingers tightened around the throttle as her gaze flicked toward the cabin through the slightly open cockpit door. Her eyes scanned the rows of passengers until they landed on a man seated near the front of business class. A familiar face from a personnel file she had once reviewed. Elias Cross. He wasn't just another passenger. Throughout the flight, Elias had kept a low profile, but Celeste had noticed him paying an unusual amount of attention to the electronic flight information display mounted on the cabin wall. At first, she had dismissed it. Maybe he was just curious. But Elias Cross wasn't looking at altitude and airspeed numbers like an ordinary traveler. He was watching something else. And then there was the small toolkit sitting on his tray table. Celeste forced her voice to remain even as she turned to Raven, who had been silently observing the cockpit's tension unfold. "I need you to keep an eye on Elias Cross." Her voice was quiet, but firm. "He seems unusually interested in our systems." Raven didn't ask questions. She simply gave a curt nod before slipping out of the cockpit, moving through the cabin with the ease of someone who had spent years mastering her craft. Raven made her way down the aisle, showing no indication that she was monitoring a specific target. As she approached Elias's row, she paused beside a nearby seat, pretending to check a passenger's seatbelt. But her sharp gaze flicked toward the toolkit on Elias's tray. From the cockpit, Celeste watched through the crack in the door, her pulse steady but heightened. Then, ever so subtly, she saw Raven's brow furrow, a small but telling reaction. A few seconds later, Raven's voice came through Celeste's earpiece, low but clear. "He's got a device. I don't know what it is, but it's definitely not standard passenger equipment." Celeste's heartbeat quickened. She glanced down at the control panel. The fuel was still disappearing. This wasn't just suspicion anymore. This was confirmation. Turning back to Gideon, she kept her voice calm, but there was an undeniable edge to it. "Captain, I think we have a serious problem." Gideon met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "What kind of problem, Vaughn?" Celeste inhaled deeply, knowing how insane this was going to sound. But she also knew this was real. Someone has tampered with the aircraft systems. A charged silence fell over the cockpit. Gideon's eyes narrowed, not dismissing her outright, but still unwilling to believe it fully. "You're telling me this fuel issue isn't a mechanical failure?" Celeste's response was unwavering. "I don't have concrete proof yet, but I strongly believe Elias Cross is involved. He's a former software engineer for a company that worked with Aurora Airlines. He was fired for suspected sabotage." Gideon's jaw tightened slightly. Celeste pressed on. "He's been monitoring our system displays the entire flight. And right now, he's in business class with a device that Raven says doesn't belong there." A muscle in Gideon's jaw twitched. For the first time, Celeste saw uncertainty in his expression. She didn't give him a chance to argue. "Captain, we need to act now. If I'm wrong, we lose a few minutes verifying. But if I'm right," she held his gaze, "then we're facing something much worse than a fuel anomaly." Gideon wasn't the type to be easily swayed, but he also wasn't a fool. A long, tense moment passed before he let out a slow exhale and nodded. "All right, but we don't make a move until we're sure what he's doing." Celeste turned to Raven, her voice steely. "Find a way to get closer. See what he's doing with that device." Raven didn't hesitate. She understood. This was no longer just a suspicion. As she disappeared down the aisle, Celeste watched her go, her heartbeat a steady, controlled rhythm in her chest. Something was happening on this flight, and if she was right, they were far from safe. The tension in the cabin was subtle, something only the most observant would notice. Everything appeared normal. Flight attendants moved through the aisles. Passengers remained strapped in as the turbulence warning light stayed on. But to Celeste, something was shifting beneath that surface. Something moving quietly in the shadows of routine. From the cockpit, she watched as Raven approached Elias Cross, her hands steady on the tablet she used to manage the passenger manifest. With a practiced ease, she reached up, pretending to check an overhead compartment. Yet her sharp gaze flickered briefly toward the small toolkit resting on Elias's tray table. Elias didn't seem to notice he was being watched. Celeste pressed her earpiece closer, listening as Raven's calm, steady voice came through the internal comms. "He's holding a device. Looks like a wireless connection module." A pulse of cold adrenaline shot through Celeste's veins. A wireless module, a tool capable of interfering with the aircraft's control systems if programmed correctly. There was no doubt in her mind anymore. She needed more information. Quickly, Celeste pulled up Elias Cross's flight record on the secondary cockpit screen. In less than a minute, his profile flashed across her display. Elias Cross, 38, former software engineer at SkySeas Technologies, a company that had once provided key systems for Aurora Airlines. Celeste's eyes narrowed as she reached the next line. Terminated 3 years ago after being suspected of involvement in a cyber attack on flight management systems. Her grip on the control stick tightened, her breath slowing as the puzzle pieces clicked into place. Elias had worked directly on the software they were flying on right now. He knew its vulnerabilities. He knew how to manipulate it. And now, he was sitting on their flight while their fuel system was failing without explanation. This wasn't coincidence. She relayed the information through her earpiece, her voice low and controlled. Elias Cross used to work for the company that built our software. More importantly, he was fired for suspected sabotage. In the cabin, Raven paused ever so slightly. She didn't respond right away, but Celeste could picture her expression. Sharp, calculating, piecing together the same chilling realization. A few seconds later, Raven's voice came through again, this time colder. "We need to know what he's doing with that device." And just like that, Raven changed tactics. Instead of observing from afar, she closed in. Her approach was deliberate control but firm, stopping beside Elias's seat. She spoke in the calm, yet authoritative voice of someone who expected immediate compliance. "Sir, I'm the lead flight attendant. I noticed you have an unauthorized electronic device. I need to inspect it." Elias looked up, his expression flickering with momentary surprise. Just for a second. Then, just as quickly, he smoothed it over, offering a casual smile. A reaction Celeste didn't like. Slowly, Elias closed the lid of his toolkit, nudging it slightly toward Raven as he spoke. "It's just a personal device. Nothing concerning, I assure you." Raven didn't react. She reached down, pretending to examine the toolkit, but never breaking eye contact with Elias. "I need you to open it." Silence stretched between them. Elias tilted his head slightly, dark eyes locking onto hers as though assessing her, measuring her resolve. Then he moved, slowly. Unlatching the lid, he lifted it just enough for Raven to see inside. A small circuit board, wired to a digital interface. A series of scrolling code flashed across its tiny screen. But before Raven could read it, Elias pressed a button. Instantly, the screen went dark. "See?" His voice was smooth, casual. Nothing unusual. Celeste's teeth clenched. From the cockpit, she had been watching everything through the cabin security feed. Elias was hiding something, but she couldn't just have him detained. Not yet. He hadn't done anything that directly violated flight security. Not yet. But if he was responsible for the fuel anomalies, then they couldn't wait for him to strike again. Through her earpiece, she spoke to Raven, her tone sharp. "Do you think he's hiding something?" Raven, still composed, answered without hesitation. "Absolutely. But he's confident. He knows we don't have enough reason to hold him." Celeste's mind raced. They couldn't confront him outright. They couldn't afford to tip him off before they knew exactly what he was doing. They had to catch him in the act. Her voice dropped lower, measured and deliberate. "Then we set a trap. We let him think we're backing off. We make him believe we bought the excuse. And when he moves again, we shut him down." From the cockpit window, the sky remained a vast, unbroken stretch of midnight black. But Celeste knew the storm was no longer outside. The real threat was sitting in their cabin. And if she didn't act fast, this flight was heading towards something far worse than turbulence. Celeste stared at the surveillance screen in the cockpit, her eyes locked onto the live feed from the cabin camera. Through the lens, she watched as Raven walked away from Elias Cross's seat. They hadn't found hard evidence to detain him, but from the tone in Raven's voice over the comms, Celeste could tell the tension had reached its peak. Elias wasn't worried, even though he knew they were watching him. He simply closed his toolkit, leaned back into his seat, and gazed out the window, as if waiting for something. Celeste hated that. The cockpit door clicked shut as Raven returned, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. Celeste pulled off her earpiece. "What did you see?" Raven's voice was quiet, but each word cut like a blade. "He's hiding something. He knows we suspect him, but he also knows we don't have enough to stop him." Gideon, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. "So what do? We can't detain a passenger just because he looks suspicious." Celeste turned to him, her gaze sharp with determination. "We can't take him in yet, but we can make him slip." Gideon raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Raven, too, gave a slow nod. "What's the plan?" Celeste exhaled, then laid it out. 10 minutes later, Raven returned to business class, this time with Michael Carter, the chief engineer. Their approach was deliberate, purposeful enough to catch the attention of a few nearby passengers. Elias was just lifting a plastic cup of water to his lips when Raven's calm but commanding voice cut through the air. "Mr. Cross, we need you to come with us." "Now." Elias paused, then slowly looked up. A flicker of amusement crossed his features. And why is that? Michael, who had previously been cautious about accusing Elias, stood firm this time. We've identified anomalies in the fuel system. You're the only person on this flight with the knowledge to interfere with it. Elias set his cup down, leaned back, and smiled. Oh, his voice was light, almost amused. So now I'm a suspect just because I could have done it? Raven didn't blink. We have records of your termination from SkySeas Technologies. You were fired after being linked to a cyber attack on a flight system. Elias let out a small, dry chuckle, shaking his head. And that automatically makes me guilty? Do you have any proof that I've done anything on this flight? The tension around them thickened. Nearby passengers shifted uncomfortably, realizing that something wasn't right. In the cockpit, Celeste clenched her fists. Elias wasn't panicking. He was playing with them. He knew they had nothing. Not yet. Raven inhaled slowly, keeping her voice even. Then answer me this. What exactly is that device you're carrying? And why have you been monitoring the aircraft systems? Elias tilted his head slightly, as if entertained by the question. Then, casually, he opened his toolkit. From inside, he retrieved the small electronic device Raven had seen earlier. He lifted it just enough for her and Michael to see. Celeste tensed as the camera finally gave her a clearer view. A wireless transmission module. Elias smirked. You mean this? Raven's eyes narrowed. What is it? A system diagnostic scanner, Elias said smoothly. I brought it to test a theory. Michael frowned. What theory? Elias leaned forward, his voice dropping. No longer mocking, but serious. You think I'm the one sabotaging this plane? His tone was low, measured. I'm not. I'm trying to fix it. Raven stilled. Her pupils contracted slightly. Michael's breath hitched. Fix it? What the hell do you mean? Elias locked eyes with him. And for the first time, Celeste felt something shift. This wasn't just a game to him. I warned Aurora Airlines 3 years ago, Elias said slowly. The fuel system they installed has a fatal flaw. If left unchecked, it could cause an in-flight failure. No one listened to me, and now I think it's happening on this flight. A sharp, cold silence fell between them. For the first time, Raven and Michael didn't know how to respond. Raven's voice was quieter when she finally spoke. You expect us to believe that this isn't sabotage, that you just happened to be on board to investigate a problem you were fired over? Elias gave a slow shrug. I don't expect you to believe me. His voice was calm. I'm just telling you the truth. Michael shook his head, still skeptical. If you knew about this flaw, why didn't you report it again? Elias laughed, but it wasn't amusement. It was bitterness. I did. 3 years ago. He leaned back, his expression darkening. And they fired me for it. The weight of his words settled over them like a heavy fog. In the cockpit, Celeste felt ice slide down her spine. If what Elias was saying was true, then the fuel anomaly wasn't sabotage. It had always been there, and today on this flight, it had finally come undone. The cockpit was suffocating with tension. Celeste stood facing Gideon, her eyes burning with unwavering determination. In her mind, the puzzle pieces were snapping into place. The abnormal fuel loss, the corrupted data, and now Elias Cross's warning. This wasn't a coincidence anymore. We can't ignore this, Captain. Her voice was firm, each word carrying weight. Elias worked on this system. He knows its flaws better than anyone. And if he says this failure could turn catastrophic, we need to take that seriously. Gideon leaned back in his seat, arms crossed. His gaze was sharp, but unreadable. Vaughn, you're seriously trusting a man who was fired for sabotaging flight systems? He's manipulating you. Celeste took a slow, controlled breath, keeping her composure despite the fire raging inside her. Do you really think I'm that easily manipulated, Captain? Her voice didn't waver. I'm not saying I trust him. I'm saying I trust the data. I trust what's right in front of us. She pointed to the control panel, where the fuel warning still flashed red, a glaring sign of impending disaster. The system is still failing, and we don't know why. If Elias is right, and we don't act, we could lose complete control of our fuel reserves. Gideon's jaw tightened, a subtle but telling sign that he couldn't dismiss her entirely. But the pride of a seasoned captain wasn't so easily shaken. "So, what do you want me to do?" His voice held a challenge. "Invite him into the cockpit? Let him tinker with our systems?" Celeste clenched her fists, forcing herself to stay calm. "I want you to put aside your damn pride and look at the facts." Her voice was low, controlled, but laced with urgency. "We have a major problem, and he might have the answer." Gideon said nothing. Outside, the storm had passed. But inside the cockpit, a different kind of storm was brewing. At the door, Raven stood in silence, watching the confrontation unfold. She didn't speak, but her sharp gaze moved between Celeste and Gideon, absorbing every word. Then, a shrill alarm pierced through the cockpit. "Red circle warning. Critical fuel loss red circle." Celeste's head snapped toward the screen. "We just lost another 3% fuel in the last 5 minutes. Her voice was quick, urgent. "At this rate, we won't have enough to reach our destination." Gideon's gaze locked onto the display. This time he couldn't ignore it. Celeste didn't waste a moment. She turned back to him, her voice quieter but heavier than ever. "We don't have time for this debate, Captain. Either we figure this out now, or we're walking into something much worse." Gideon was still hesitating, but Celeste could see the first crack in his resistance, and she knew she was gaining ground. Celeste's pulse pounded as she stared at Gideon, waiting for him to make a choice. The red warning lights continued to flash relentlessly on the control panel. Fuel was draining faster than expected. They had only a few hours left before things spiraled beyond control. And yet, Gideon still hadn't made a move. Celeste couldn't understand it. How could a seasoned captain hesitate in the face of a clear and present danger? She couldn't let this flight become a disaster because of one man's reluctance. "Captain, we're out of time." Celeste's voice was sharp, each syllable weighted with urgency. "We need to check the system right now, and Elias Cross may be the only one who can help us." Gideon's grip tightened on the armrest, his blue eyes glinting coldly. "You want me to let a man, who was fired for tampering with flight systems, touch this plane?" Celeste didn't waver. "I want you to put safety above everything else. We have no other option. There are always other options." Gideon shot back. "We can continue monitoring the fuel, adjust course, and if necessary, make an emergency landing at the nearest airport." Celeste clenched her jaw, fighting back the frustration burning inside her. "And what if we don't have enough fuel to make it?" Gideon didn't answer immediately. She could see it, the war waging inside him. Outside the cockpit windows, the night sky stretched endlessly, vast and unknowable. But inside, a battle was unfolding, one that had nothing to do with turbulence or failing systems. Celeste could feel Raven Cole watching from the doorway. The lead flight attendant had remained silent throughout the argument, but Celeste knew she had been listening to everything. Raven didn't trust Elias, but more importantly, she had seen the same warning Celeste had. She had seen Celeste be right before, when Gideon had been wrong. For a few long seconds, the tension hung between them all like a razor's edge. Then Raven finally spoke. Her voice was steady, unshakable. "She's right, Captain." Both Celeste and Gideon turned to look at her. Raven stepped forward, her gaze unwavering. "I don't like Elias, but we have to admit one thing. He knows this system better than anyone else on this plane. And if he really has a way to fix it, we need to let him try." Gideon's jaw tightened, but this time he didn't dismiss her outright. Raven held his gaze. Her voice softened slightly, but her words struck with precision. "Captain, you know better than anyone. When it comes to emergencies, we can't let ego get in the way." It was the one argument Gideon couldn't fight. Slowly, he leaned back in his seat, rubbing a hand over his temple as if the weight of the decision was pressing down on him. Celeste could feel the storm inside him, the sheer resistance of a man who had spent decades relying on his own judgment. Finally, he exhaled, his sharp eyes still clouded with hesitation but less resistant than before. "Then what do you propose, Vaughn?" Celeste knew this was it, the turning point. She inhaled deeply before speaking, her tone measured, firm. "We let Elias examine the system, but under strict supervision. I'll monitor him personally, along with Michael Carter. He only has access to what we allow, and if he does anything suspicious, We shut him down immediately." Gideon frowned, but deep down, he knew this was the only viable path forward. A long silence settled over the cockpit. Then, finally, Gideon closed his eyes for a brief moment before opening them again, something in them softer than before. "Fine." His voice was gruff but decisive. "But if he steps out of line, then we stop him." Celeste finished for him. Gideon nodded, his reluctance still visible, but his resistance finally cracked. Celeste let out a slow, quiet breath. She had won this round, but deep down, she knew the real battle was still ahead. Because the most important question remained: could they trust Elias Cross? The cockpit remained thick with tension after Gideon's decision. Celeste could feel it in the air, the weight of uncertainty pressing down on all of them. The captain had reluctantly agreed to let Elias check the system, but she knew he still didn't fully trust the decision. Neither did she. But between trusting a man with a questionable past and letting the plane continue to hemorrhage fuel without taking action, she had chosen the lesser risk. And Raven had seen that too. Celeste's gaze flicked toward Raven, who stood silently at the cockpit door, observing everything. She didn't say a word, but in her eyes, Celeste saw something she hadn't before: understanding. They came from two different worlds, one a first officer, the other a lead flight attendant. Their roles, their responsibilities, their ways of assessing a crisis were never the same. But in this moment, they stood on the same side. Celeste was used to fighting alone to prove herself. But this time, she wasn't alone. Raven had chosen to stand with her. Raven strode back into the cabin, her steps steady and deliberate. She moved with the kind of certainty that left no room for argument. Celeste followed close behind, her guard still raised. Elias Cross sat comfortably in his seat, his expression too relaxed for someone being investigated on a failing flight. When he saw Raven and Celeste approaching, he simply arched a brow, his lips curling into a knowing smirk. Raven didn't waste time. She stood directly before him, her voice calm but laced with authority. "Mr. Cross, the captain has agreed to let you examine the system. But let's be clear, you are only allowed access under our supervision. If you do anything outside those parameters, you will be restrained immediately." Elias blinked, as if genuinely impressed by Raven's directness. Then he turned his gaze to Celeste, amusement flickering in his dark eyes. "You convinced him?" He let out a soft chuckle. "Faster than I expected." Celeste didn't bite. Her voice was steady, but her gaze was razor sharp. "This isn't about you. This is about the safety of everyone on this plane. If you can actually fix this, prove it." Elias studied her for a long moment. Then he smiled. "All right." As he rose from his seat, Celeste caught the subtle way Raven tensed beside her. They both knew they couldn't trust him completely. But they also knew if he tried anything, Raven would be the first to act. And somehow, that made Celeste feel a little more at ease. They escorted Elias to the auxiliary control panel, a station used to monitor the fuel system. Michael Carter was already waiting, arms crossed, his expression uneasy as Elias approached. He leaned toward Celeste and muttered, "We're actually letting him touch the system?" Celeste gave a slow nod. "We don't have a choice." Michael exhaled, reluctant but understanding, and stepped aside as Elias moved closer to the screen. For a few seconds, Elias simply observed the display, his expression unreadable. Then, he let out a low whistle. "Well, you're screwed. We didn't need you to tell us that." Raven shot back. "Fix it." Elias smirked, rolling his shoulders. Then his fingers moved, fast. His hands danced across the touchscreen, navigating through layers of data with unsettling ease. Celeste stood stiff, watching his every move. She knew Gideon still didn't fully trust her. She knew she couldn't trust Elias. But she trusted Raven. She trusted the woman who had spoken up for her when no one else had. She trusted the woman who wasn't just following orders, but making her own calls. That meant more than any words ever could. Celeste had never expected anyone to stand beside her in a fight. But this time, Raven had. And maybe, up here in the cold, uncertain darkness, somewhere between danger and survival, They had finally begun to trust each other. The cockpit was thick with silence. Gideon Wright sat motionless, his gaze locked onto the control panel. Through his headset, he could hear everything: Celeste's steady reports, the rapid keystrokes of Elias Cross, and every so often, Raven's low, authoritative voice, warning him not to overstep his boundaries. He didn't like this, not because he thought Celeste was wrong, but because, for the first time in his career, he was being forced to place his trust in someone he didn't want to trust. Elias Cross was still a wild card, a man with a shady past, a man even Celeste admitted she couldn't fully trust. But the reality was, he had no other choice. The fuel was disappearing faster than ever, and if they didn't find the cause immediately, they might not have enough to reach safety. Gideon's hands tightened on the yoke. This wasn't just a decision. It was a gamble. Captain, Elias just found an anomaly in the fuel control system. Celeste's voice crackled through the headset, pulling Gideon from his thoughts. His brows furrowed. What kind of anomaly? A brief silence. Then Elias's voice came through, and for the first time, there was no sarcasm. A miscalibrated fuel control sequence. A cold sensation ran down Gideon's spine. Miscalibrated? Elias continued, his tone controlled but urgent. I told you from the beginning, this system has a long-standing software flaw. It's not a mechanical failure. It's a programming issue. And if we don't fix it now, the system will keep draining fuel, regardless of our actual usage. Michael Carter stiffened. What does that mean? Elias swiveled the screen, displaying lines of data to Celeste and Michael. Put simply, the aircraft believes it's flying under normal conditions. But in reality, it's burning fuel 30% faster than it should. His voice was clipped. This issue lies deep in the software, and it only triggers after extended flight time without a manual update from ground control. Celeste's breath hitched. That explained everything. The unexplained loss, the rapid depletion, the system failing to recognize how much fuel they actually had left. She swallowed hard. Can you fix it? Elias didn't hesitate. I can rewrite the sequence to correct the readings, but I need access to the primary control panel. Silence. All eyes turned to Gideon. Gideon clenched his jaw. Letting Elias access the primary controls meant giving him direct input into the plane's most critical systems, something he never thought he'd allow. It was a risk, a big one, but then Celeste met his gaze and didn't look away. Captain, you've seen the numbers. Her voice was steady, unwavering. We're running out of time. Gideon held her stare, his mind warring with itself. Celeste Vaughn. She had challenged him from the start of this flight. She had proven him wrong about the storm. She had stood her ground through every doubt, every fight, every impossible choice. And now, she was staking everything on this call. If he said no, they might never make it to their destination. If he said yes, he would be placing the entire fate of this flight into the hands of a man he didn't trust. But Celeste believed in her choice. And for the first time in his career, Gideon believed in Celeste. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. Then he exhaled. His voice, when he spoke, was calm, unshakable. Do it. A breath shuddered out of Celeste, but she kept her composure. Elias simply shrugged, as if he had already known what Gideon would say. Gideon leaned forward, his eyes sharp as steel as they locked onto Elias. But hear me, Cross. If you do anything suspicious, I'll be the one to throw you out of this cockpit. Elias smirked, but this time, there was no mockery in it. Fair enough. He slid into the auxiliary seat, his fingers already moving at an unnerving speed across the keyboard. The lines of code blurred and shifted on the screen as he dived into the aircraft's core system. Celeste hovered close, watching every single keystroke, ready to shut him down the second he crossed the line. And Raven stood directly behind him, her presence silent but unmistakably lethal. Gideon said nothing, but Celeste knew. He was still fighting this decision in his head. He had accepted the risk, but that didn't mean he was comfortable with it. This flight was far from safe, but at least now, they had a fighting chance. Time was running out. Celeste's grip tightened around the control yoke, feeling every violent jolt as the plane pushed through turbulent air. Outside, The sky remained a deep, oppressive black, thunderheads churning in the distance. Lightning flickered across the horizon, a stark warning that the storm was far from over. At the technical console, Elias Cross worked with ruthless precision, his fingers flying over the keyboard, lines of code flashing across the screen. Michael Carter stood beside him, watching every move like a hawk, ready to intervene the second Elias did anything suspicious. From the cockpit, Gideon glanced at the fuel gauge, his sharp blue eyes darkening. The numbers were dropping dangerously fast. If Elias didn't fix this within minutes, they wouldn't have enough fuel to reach any airport. Celeste swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay calm. Panic wasn't an option. Gideon, we need to stabilize the plane. Elias can't work properly if we keep getting thrown around like this. Her voice was firm, focused. Gideon clenched his jaw, but he knew she was right. As much as he hated relying on Elias, this wasn't about trust anymore. It was about survival. Fine, Vaughn. Dropping to FL 310. We'll get out of the worst of it. Celeste adjusted the controls, feeling the plane descend steadily, leveling out of the roughest air pockets. The turbulence remained, but less brutal than before. In the passenger cabin, Raven Cole moved swiftly, scanning each row, maintaining control. The tension had begun to seep into the passengers. People were whispering, eyes darting anxiously toward the windows. One wrong move, and panic could spread like wildfire. Raven reached for the intercom, her voice calm, measured, and unshakable. Ladies and gentlemen, we are currently experiencing mild turbulence due to unfavorable weather conditions. The flight crew is handling the situation, and your safety remains our top priority. Please remain seated and follow all instructions. No empty reassurances. No sugarcoating. Just the truth, delivered by someone who sounded like she had everything under control. Celeste heard her through the internal comms and knew that, at the very least, the passengers had a leader they could trust. At the fuel control panel, Elias was working at a blistering pace. Sweat trickled down his temple, but he didn't stop to wipe it away. He muttered under his breath, his voice too low for anyone but Michael to hear. Celeste stole a glance at him through the cockpit's reflection mirror. How much longer? Elias didn't look up. Less than 5 minutes. His tone was clipped. I'm rewriting the fuel calibration script, but there's an automatic lockout in place. I need to override it before I can reset the system. 5 minutes. Celeste's fingers curled into fists. It didn't sound long, but right now, 5 minutes could mean the difference between life and death for over 200 people. Gideon continued to monitor the fuel status, his features grim. Celeste could tell he still didn't trust Elias, but at least now he trusted her. 1 minute passed, then 2. Outside, the storm began to thin, the sky lightening ever so slightly, but it wasn't calm yet. Celeste barely noticed. Her eyes stayed locked on the fuel gauge, waiting for a change, waiting for a sign that Elias had done what he promised. Then, almost there, for the first time, Elias's voice held no sarcasm, only urgency. Michael gave a tight nod, his focus glued to the screen. Good. Just don't screw this up. Elias let out a dry chuckle. Trust me, I have no interest in falling out of the sky with the rest of you. Gideon checked his watch. 30 minutes of fuel remaining. Far less than what was safe. Celeste's whole body felt coiled, every muscle drawn tight, but her voice remained steady. Elias, it's now or never. No response. Then, a soft beep. Elias sat back, his dark eyes flashing. It's done. Celeste felt a brief wave of relief as Elias Cross looked up, his sharp eyes glinting with something between exhaustion and triumph. It's done. 2 simple words, but they carried the weight of every single life on this plane. Celeste's gaze snapped to the control panel. The numbers had stabilized. The fuel flow had corrected itself, the engines responding more smoothly, like a body regaining its strength after a near-fatal shock. Beside her, Gideon Wright stared at the readings, his posture still tense, but his grip on the controls loosening slightly. The system is stable. His voice was low, almost disbelieving. Behind them, Raven Cole exhaled a quiet breath, while Michael Carter nodded, though his watchful eyes still held caution. For a moment, it felt like they had won. Then, a shrill alarm shattered the fragile silence. Red circle warning. Engine 2 malfunction, red circle. The cockpit froze. Then, a violent jolt rocked the entire aircraft. It was as if an invisible force had just slammed into the fuselage. Celeste's hands locked onto the yoke as a noticeable imbalance pulled the aircraft to the right. Engine 2 was failing. Gideon's hands flew over the controls. Fuel flow is steady, but Engine 2 isn't producing optimal thrust. If it shuts down completely, we'll lose balance. Michael cursed under his breath, scanning the data. If the fuel issue caused airflow disruption, it could be starving the engine. I'll check now. In the cabin, Raven felt it immediately, the sudden shift, the unsteady weight of the aircraft. Passengers stirred, their anxiety sharpening into something far more dangerous, fear. Someone called out, "What's happening now?" Raven clenched her hands briefly, taking a measured breath before lifting the PA microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing a technical issue. The crew is actively handling the situation, and the aircraft remains under control. Please remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened." She didn't promise. She didn't lie. She just told the truth, with a voice that inspired trust. Celeste heard her over the internal comms, and she knew Raven had the passengers under control. In the cockpit, Celeste could feel the unnatural drag in the controls. If Engine 2 failed completely, they would have asymmetrical thrust, making the aircraft dangerously unstable. "We need to rebalance immediately," she said, voice tight with urgency. "I'm reducing Engine 1's power to compensate." For the first time, Gideon didn't question her. He nodded, hands moving in tandem with hers, a seamless, unspoken coordination. Celeste carefully adjusted the angle of attack, trying to maintain lift without sacrificing too much altitude. One wrong move, and they would spiral. Michael's fingers flew over the engine diagnostics panel. "Engine 2 isn't dead yet, but it's overheating. We need to restart it before it fails completely." Celeste's eyes flicked toward Elias, who was already scanning the system logs. "Can you override it?" Elias clenched his jaw, then nodded. "I can try resetting the engine control system, but it'll take a few minutes." A few minutes? With one failing engine? That was an eternity. In the cabin, the imbalance was becoming noticeable. A few passengers clutched their armrests, eyes darting to the windows. Some whispered prayers under their breath. Raven stood in the aisle, unmoving, scanning the faces around her. A young boy, no older than 8, gripped his mother's sleeve, wide-eyed with fear. He hesitated, then whispered, "Is the flight attendant scared?" Raven heard him. She crouched beside him, meeting his gaze, her voice quiet but firm. "I've flown through worse." She smiled just slightly. "We'll be okay." The boy stared at her for a moment. Then he nodded, still clutching his mother, but a little steadier than before. In the cockpit, Michael suddenly tensed. "The system's responding. We can restart Engine 2 now." Celeste didn't hesitate. "Do it." Elias entered the final command. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. A low whirring sound echoed through the aircraft. Then, Engine 2 roared back to life. The aircraft shuddered, then steadied. The imbalance faded. They were stable. Gideon stared at the controls, then slowly looked at Celeste. For the first time on this flight, he truly saw her as his equal. He exhaled deeply, voice low but certain. "You did well, Vaughn." Celeste didn't look at him. She just kept flying, but a small, quiet smile touched the corner of her lips. They weren't on the ground yet, but at least they had a real chance. The sky ahead was clearing, but their final test was far from over. The turbulence had passed. The fuel system was stabilized. Engine 2 had been restarted. For a fleeting moment, Celeste allowed herself to think they had made it. But then, red circle warning. Fuel remaining. 15 minutes of flight time, red circle. Her breath hitched. The system was fixed, but the damage had already been done. Too much fuel had been lost. They wouldn't make it to their intended destination. Gideon saw it too. His jaw clenched, eyes locked onto the navigation display. "We need to land. Now." Celeste scanned the nearest airports. Only one was within reach, Kingston International Airport, Jamaica, less than 100 miles away. But there was a problem. "Can Kingston take us?" she asked, already preparing for a course change. Gideon had air traffic control on the line, but when the response came, it sent a chill through the cockpit. "Aurora 721, be advised. Kingston is experiencing strong crosswinds due to the storm. Main runway is closed. Only the secondary runway is available, but visibility is extremely low. Do you confirm emergency landing?" Celeste's grip tightened. A shorter, slicker runway, heavy crosswinds, limited visibility. It was a nightmare scenario. But there was no other choice. Gideon turned to her, and for the first time, there was no hesitation, no doubt. Only trust. "Do you want to take the landing, Vaughn?" This wasn't a test. It was a recognition. Celeste drew in a slow breath, then gave a firm nod. "More than ready, Captain." Gideon nodded once. "I'll back you up." For the first time, they were a team. Celeste adjusted their approach, eyes flicking across every instrument. She felt the plane's response, the shift of the wind, the unseen forces fighting against them. As they descended, the crosswind struck hard, yanking the aircraft sideways. The plane shuddered violently as it cut through the unstable air. Michael's voice came through the comms. "Speed is high. You need to slow before touchdown." Celeste's grip never wavered. "I know." She eased back on the throttles, keeping the nose steady, holding the perfect descent angle. In the cabin, every passenger was holding their breath. Raven stood at the front, her stance firm, the comm center in a storm of fear. Her presence alone kept the panic at bay. Ground was approaching fast. 50 feet. 40. Celeste held the plane steady, fighting the wind, fighting gravity itself. 20 feet. 10. Touchdown. The rear wheels met the runway smoothly, but then a sudden gust slammed into the fuselage, tilting the aircraft. Celeste reacted instantly, correcting with precise rudder control, keeping the plane from veering off course. Front wheel down. She reversed thrust, engines roaring as the brakes engaged. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. 15. The plane slowed, then rolled to a stop. For a single, suspended second, silence. Then, applause. Cheers. The sound of people crying in relief. They had survived. Gideon turned to Celeste, studying her for a long moment. Then he gave her a slow, approving nod, a hint of a smile. "You saved all of us today. I was wrong to underestimate you." Celeste didn't look at him. She was still catching her breath. But she smiled, not out of pride, just because she had done what needed to be done. Sometimes, a little trust is all it takes. As soon as the plane stopped, Elias Cross was escorted off by security. But before being led away, he turned to Celeste. For the first time, his smirk was gone. What remained was a quiet, genuine respect. "You really can fly, Vaughn?" Celeste didn't answer, but she knew this time he truly meant it. Before leaving the aircraft, Celeste made one last stop. She sought out the Aurora Airlines technical director, demanding a full investigation into the software flaw Elias had warned about. "We avoided disaster today, but we won't always be that lucky." Outside, Celeste stepped onto the runway. The sky, finally clear, stretched endlessly above her. She had proven herself. She had earned respect. But more than that, she had earned her place here. Because this sky, it was hers, and she was ready to conquer it. Celeste Vaughn's story is more than just a fight for survival in the skies. It is a lesson in faith, resilience, and unwavering determination. In today's unforgiving world, we, too, face our own tempests, prejudice, doubt, the crushing weight of professional struggles. But like Celeste, the key is to never surrender, to believe in our own strength, and to embrace every chance to prove we are worthy. Sometimes, all it takes is one person who believes in you, or even just the courage to believe in yourself, to turn the tide. Persevere, learn, and take action. That is how we rise above adversity. One flight, one challenge, and a change no one saw coming. But is this just the end of one battle or the start of something bigger? Share your thoughts, and subscribe for more powerful stories.